So, hello people, welcome to another podcast with Martin Barna and Institute of Modern Nutrition. I am Martin Barna, online nutrition and fitness, and I will be your host for this podcast. Later on, the recording will be released on my Spotify, YouTube, and Facebook. You can find all the links on martinbarna.cz. Many thanks to the Institute of Modern Nutrition, Miloslav and Lukas, for their cooperation and shared enthusiasm for spreading science-based information from the best in the world. Our honorable guest for today is Professor Stuart Phillips. Professor Phillips is an experienced speaker who seeks to popularize the topics of protein intake, physical activity, and healthy aging. He has already given more than 300 public lectures on these topics for academics and the general public. He has also won awards for his teaching activities at McMaster University. Professor Phillips has received several grants and awards for his scientific activities. He is also an expert and key leader in protein research in terms of exercise, weight reduction, and aging. He is even one of the most cited scientists in the world in the field of protein research. You can find Professor Phillips on Instagram as McInProf and also on Facebook as Stuart Phillips, PhD. Hello, Stuart. How are you today?
Morning, Martin. I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming here. Today's program will include first 50 minutes a lecture about an evidence-based approach to understanding resistance training. Then we will have 10 minutes for questions. Topics Professor Phillips will cover are: what is evidence-based resistance training? How much of an effect does protein have on muscle gains? Does load drive hypertrophic or strength adaptations? Are systemic hormonal changes affecting hypertrophy? These other topics, you can send us questions in comments on Facebook, and we will have a few minutes to answer these from Dr. Phillips. Professor Phillips, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, and thanks again for having me on the show. So when we talk about evidence bases to try and program exercise variables for resistance exercise, a model that we think about in my lab is that the phenotype, in this case hypertrophy, is a product of genes and the environment. So we can't really do too much to change our genes, but we can change their expression by understanding the influence that external environmental variables might have. These might be variables related to resistance exercise, sleep, diet, or taking supplements. So some of the external variables that I'm going to talk to you about today, the first one is about diet and the effect of dietary protein. And the question that you want to ask yourself is whether greater protein intakes in the form of supplements or dietary foods are both sufficient, that is, they can help hypertrophy, but they are also necessary. Do you need to take them for greater gains in muscle mass? We're also going to talk about the effect of load and ask the question whether heavier weights are both sufficient and necessary for inducing hypertrophy and gains in strength. And then finally, as Martin said, we're going to talk about changes in systemic hormone concentrations that occur specifically after the onset of resistance exercise. So are these acute post-exercise rises in what are called anabolic hormones, are they sufficient and necessary for the induction of hypertrophy and strength gains? To understand what we mean about the difference between evidence-based versus belief-based, we have to understand what science is. And science is the process of understanding the world through experimentation and observation, whereas beliefs are feelings that something is true and they are internally held understandings. So an unscientific belief is something that is held as generalizable fact without substantial scientific supporting evidence. In other words, we think that's true, but we don't really know. So the first thing we're going to talk about is protein supplementation. And to give you a brief introduction as to how muscle mass is regulated, the analogy that I like to use is that imagine that your muscle is a brick wall. When we put bricks into the wall, we call that a stimulation of the process of muscle protein synthesis. And you can see here that when somebody eats a protein-containing meal, there's a rapid stimulation of protein synthesis, which subsequently declines until the other meal, and then subsequently declines again, only to be stimulated at the third meal of the day. Rates of protein breakdown are like bricks being taken out of the wall. And you can see that every time you eat protein, you get a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, and the green area indicates muscle gain. The gray area is a little bit of muscle loss. These are not things, obviously, that you can measure on a scale. But the important point from this graph to take away is that variations in muscle protein synthesis are what affect muscle mass. And the effect of protein ingestion alone is transient. In other words, it lasts only 3 to 4 hours. The situation is different when we've performed resistance exercise. We get a greater rise in muscle protein synthesis and a smaller decline in muscle protein synthesis in the fasted state. You can see that these green areas are greater than the gray areas, and over time, this is the change that leads to the accretion or the gain of muscle protein. These are the data from Dan Moore to sort of illustrate that effect, and you can see the effect on myofibrillar proteins, which are the force-generating proteins in muscle, goes up and comes down in the fed state, but goes up and remains elevated in the fed and exercise condition. This is not as true for the non-myofibrillar or non-force-generating proteins, which are transiently stimulated. And in this figure, I'm trying to make the point to you that the window in which we can consume protein to get an extra or added stimulation of protein synthesis is probably quite long. In other words, it's up to 24 and maybe as much as 48 hours. And these are the data that were generated in 1997, which is now pretty old, to show you that protein synthesis is up for at least 2 days after a bout of resistance exercise. So feeding-induced changes in muscle protein synthesis are enhanced by resistance exercise, and fasted state losses are lower. So resistance exercise is fundamentally anabolic, and this effect is long-lasting. One of the questions that we asked ourselves several years ago was what was an optimal amount of protein in a single dose to stimulate muscle protein synthesis maximally. These data from Dan Moore show you that in young men, after having performed an intense bout of leg resistance exercise, that only 20 grams of protein maximized the muscle protein synthetic response. Doubling the protein from 20 to 40 grams resulted in a small but non-significant additional only 11% increase in muscle protein synthesis. We realized, however, that there had to be variability in this dose number because smaller individuals would require less and larger individuals would require more. So if we take this 20 grams of protein and we divide it by the body weight of the subjects, we can see that around 1/4 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal now is optimally stimulatory for muscle protein synthesis. So this was the conclusion of this paper. And I suppose at this point, after talking about all of these mechanistic underpinnings of muscle, you might ask yourself whether any or all of this really matters. In other words, does protein supplementation have an effect? So I'm going to give you what I call an evidence-based answer. And the evidence basis comes from a systematic review and a meta-analysis that Rob Morton, a former PhD student of mine, performed, and we published only 3 years ago. What you can see is that these are the sum effects, this little dot down here and this little dot here, of protein supplementation on gains in lean body mass and in strength. When we talk about fat or lean body mass here, you can see that in 26 different interventions, we got an increase of about 0.3 kilos. Remember, this is fat-free mass, some of which is obviously muscle. It's a statistically significant result, but it's rather small. When we look at the effect of the protein on strength, the one lift that was common to 28 different interventions was a leg press, and it accumulated an extra 2.5 kilos of strength. And if you look and see where the significant effect comes from, it comes from all the studies that you can see here, which are in trained individuals. If we fast forward a little bit more to the most recent meta-analysis that we've done, this was published just this year. Everson Nunez, a postdoc in my lab, was the lead author. And he asked the question again, does a higher protein intake increase muscle mass? Or in older people, does it improve muscle function? So daily protein supplements were generally in the form of milk protein or from a protein source such as yogurt and eggs or other nutritional supplements, in some cases with soy powder. So we wanted to know whether resistance exercise training or aging affected the outcomes. We included 74 randomized controlled trials, and the mean duration was somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks. The majority of them used animal protein, and the majority of those were from strength-based protein. And these are the key outcomes or takeaways. Lower body strength gain in randomized controlled trials testing protein and resistance training. We had 47 randomized controlled trials, and we saw a small but significant increase, but only in young subjects. When we looked at the bench press, again, there was a small but significant increase of about 2 kilos. There was no effect in physical function changes in older individuals and no effect on hand grip strength. So the takeaway message from this portion of the talk is that protein supplementation augments hypertrophy. It is sufficient and necessary. But an important side note is that the effect is not big compared to gains in muscle mass made. So we could talk about larger doses of protein, we could talk about longer periods, but the effect of protein is pretty small. In other words, we could talk about a number of different variables that aren't covered in all of these meta-analyses, but I don't think they would have a significant effect on any of the outcomes. The next variable we're going to talk about that's external to the system is external load. And I think most people would recognize this strength endurance continuum here, which talks about repetition maximum ranges in which strength is maximized and we get minimal changes in hypertrophy or endurance. And then when we shift to repetition ranges that are in the sort of 6 to 7 or 8 to 10 to 12 of 1 RM, this is where hypertrophy is supposed to be maximized. And if we get to higher repetition ranges, this is where muscular endurance is emphasized and less strength and less hypertrophy occur. The important point to remember is something called the principle of specificity. That says that the mode of training that we employ to test our subjects will always emphasize the outcome of the variable that we use to manipulate during the study itself. So if we want to have people be stronger, we should have people perform loads or lifts down in this low range. Similarly, if we wanted muscular endurance, we would train people in this range. The question is, however, whether hypertrophy or muscle growth is really maximized in this repetition range. So what are the studies on which this guideline was based? One of them is this study by, by Carvalho, and you can see that it's been cited, it's been cited over 500 times, and it talks about muscular adaptations in response to 3 different resistance exercise training regimes. We've got a low repetition, an intermediate, and a high repetition group. This is the change in 1 RM strength, and these findings would appear to support, from a leg press, squat, and leg extension standpoint, the strength endurance continuum. In other words, high repetition versus low repetition favors the high repetition group for increasing strength. But remember, the low repetition group was testing in a range that was very close to the test that they're using to assess strength gains. When tested in an unpracticed manner, I would question whether these strength changes are actually transferable across conditions, and would bet that actually most of these conditions would see about the same strength gains. When we look at changes in muscle fiber area, and I apologize for showing you a table here, these are changes in muscle fiber type, which you can see not in the control group, no change, but in the low repetition and in the intermediate repetition were significant, but nothing shows up as significant in the high repetition group. Again, in support of the strength endurance continuum. Or perhaps the most influential study on which these guidelines were based was actually conducted in 1946 by Thomas DeLorme, entitled Heavy Resistance Exercises. In these days, Captain Thomas DeLorme was an Air Force medical doctor and was rehabilitating soldiers that had returned from fighting in World War II. He wrote that most injuries of the trunk and extremities resulted in atrophy, and that redevelopment of muscle power, he actually used the wrong word here, this should be muscle strength, is the most important factor in restoring normal function. Interestingly enough, the principle then of heavy resistance and low repetition exercise, he said, was far better for developing muscular power, which he really meant to say was strength, versus things like stationary biking and stair climbing. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that statement. The problem is, what he didn't say is heavier versus lighter resistance exercise. And that actually wasn't tested in the paper that he published. So he concluded that rather than attempt to develop endurance, we should restore muscle strength to normal and then build endurance by means of low resistance, higher repetition exercises, which to him meant things like stationary bicycling and stair climbing. The question is this paradigm really correct? Does external load drive hypertrophy? The question to ask yourself is, at momentary muscular failure or fatigue, whether if the principle of recruitment of motor units is followed, we shouldn't get the same motor unit recruitment no matter which load we use to drive fatigue or failure. The mechanisms of fatigue or failure will be different in somebody who's lifting heavier weights. However, even in somebody lifting lighter weights going to fatigue, all motor units would be activated. I'm going to show you this study first, which comes from our lab. This is Nick Bird, who was a PhD student of mine at the time, in which we use higher and lower intensity loads with matched and non-matched volumes. So we had one leg perform at 90% of 1 RM to failure, generally between 3 to most 4 repetitions, and then 30% of 1 repetition max to match the same amount of external work done at the 90% condition, which was 30% work matched, or 30% of 1 RM to failure. When we assess the rates of muscle protein synthesis in various protein fractions in all 3 conditions. This figure shows you the rates of the mixed muscle protein. So this is all of the proteins within the muscle. These are the myofibrillar or force-generating proteins inside the muscle, and these are the sarcoplasmic or non-myofibrillar proteins. What you can see is that there's a rise in muscle protein synthesis in all 3 conditions at this time, and it's still preserved at 24 hours post-exercise. Statistically speaking, it's greatest in the 90 fail and 30 fail, but not in the 30 work match conditions. So simply doing the same amount of work, in other words, the amount of volume load that equates these 2 legs, does not result in a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, but taking things to failure does. These are both significant from the rested condition and from the respective work match 30% condition at all time points. You can see the same in the non-myofibrillar proteins, and even at 24 hours, it's only in the 30 fail condition that we see a continued stimulation of protein synthesis, and similarly so in the sarcoplasmic protein synthesis rates. So in conclusion, these results at least suggest that low load, higher volume resistance exercise is maybe even more effective at inducing acute muscle changes in protein synthesis due to the high load and low volume the high load, low volume or work match resistance exercise modes. The paper got published. We received lots of feedback, but the feedback that we received from social media was perhaps the most revealing. The first was, this is just muscle protein synthesis and not actual hypertrophy. That's correct. Somebody said, who lifts at 30%? You're not going to get stronger that way. And that may be true, particularly when the testing mode is specific to the form of exercise that's done. Fast forward a few years, and this is Cameron Mitchell, in which he performed a study which the overall purpose was to test whether the acute results we had observed previously would be reflected in longer-term resistance training adaptations. So we had resistance training at 30% of 1 RM to fatigue, and we compared that to a more practical or hypertrophy range, which was about 80% of 1 RM to fatigue, or about 8 to 10 repetitions in each set. When we took a look at the changes in quadriceps volume, which we assessed using MRI, or the gold standard method for assessing muscular growth, what you can see is that there was no difference between 30% performed for 3 sets or 80% performed for 3 sets. When we compared the changes in strength, we saw exactly what you might predict. In other words, 1 RM went up in the 30% group as it did in the 80% group, but it went up to a greater extent in the 80% group. When you think about it, and you think about the principle of specificity, this finding makes perfect sense. The group that's training at 80% of their 1 RM is only 20% away from their 1 RM. It's not surprising, however, then, that these people get better at performing 1 RMs. When you do 30%, you're 70% away from your 1 RM. So you don't get as practiced at doing the task. So to emphasize that point, this is the strength gained in isometric torque, which neither of these groups practiced. And you can see that both groups experienced a gain, and neither group is different from the other. So in an unpracticed task, you can see that the strength gains are equivalent between the two. And that would have to make sense given that they've experienced the same degree of muscular hypertrophy. So in accordance with our previous acute measures of muscle protein synthesis, lower loads lifted to failure resulted in similar hypertrophy as heavier loads or higher loads lifted to failure. Again, the paper was published, it was cited widely, and yet from social media, here's what we heard. This was a unilateral design. We compared one leg to the other person's leg, so it's within a person. That's true. At the same time, these were naive or untrained subjects who apparently respond to everything. In other words, these are what people refer to as noob gains. And finally, lifting at 30%, you don't get as strong. So who really cares? So to convince people, we designed a study in which we used trained participants. We used a non-unilateral design with sufficient power. And the aim was to make people as strong as we could using a lower load protocol. And we realized that we're probably never going to please everyone. So 2 people teamed up for this study. This is Dr. Sarah Oikawa and Dr. Rob Morton, 2 former PhD students from my lab. And they performed a study in young men who were resistance trained, and they were divided, 25 of them in each group, matched for strength and their lean mass. They were trained using low repetition or heavy weights or high repetition or light weights. So they performed sets from 8 to 12 repetitions, which was the heavier group, or 20 to 25 repetitions, which was the high repetition group. And we strength tested these individuals every 3rd week. So we gave everybody the opportunity to practice lifting the heavier loads, which we thought would actually show that it's practice and not muscle mass specifically, or something specific to the heavier weights that results in any of the changes. We took muscle biopsies, we performed DEXA scans, we also took hormonal measurements pre and post training. Fast forwarding and right to the key outcome, this is lean body mass by DEXA. You can see that in the high rep and the low rep group, so in the lighter weight and the heavier weight group, everybody went up, and they went up to the same extent. There were no differences in lean body mass changes. At the same time, when we look at changes in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, everybody went up in both the type 1 and their type 2 fibers to the same extent. In other words, the load lifted did not influence the outcome with respect to hypertrophy. When we looked at strength gains, you can see that in 4 different lifts here, which were leg press, knee extension, bench press, and shoulder press, we got the same increases. High repetition and low repetition groups saw the same increase in leg press, knee extension, and shoulder press. And it was true that in the low repetition group, they did see a statistically significant, albeit about a 2 kilogram difference in their bench press strength. So From this study, we would argue that resistance exercise load determines neither hypertrophy nor strength gains, and it's simply practicing lifting strong or heavier weights that gets a person stronger and explains the differences between the two groups. So we saw no differences in the increases in lean mass, no differences in the increase in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, no differences in the gains in any fiber type that were different between the group, and no differences in strength with the exception of a small 2% difference in the bench press. So once again, does any or all of this really matter? Are heavier loads better or not? So to give you an evidence-based answer, I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, and look at his meta-analysis that he published in 2017 that you can see here. This shows you the influence of all of these training protocols that compared lower load to higher load on strength. And you can see, again, not unexpectedly, they've cited our study results here, there is an influence of high load. It's the effect of practice. It's the effect of lifting heavier loads that allows this outcome to be achieved. But when we look at the outcome in unpracticed strength tasks, you can see that there's no significant difference between a low load and a high load, indicating really that it's the effect of lifting the heavier loads and getting better at practicing doing that that allows these strength gains to happen. Importantly, when you look at any outcome based, whether it's on MRI, muscle fiber cross-sectional area, or muscle thickness, there's absolutely no difference between the amount of muscle gained when you lift lower loads versus heavier loads. So it's simply the point of going to muscular failure or momentary fatigue that maybe is responsible for the equation or for equating the outcomes in these two conditions. I'm going to update you, however, with another, very good meta-analysis that was just published this year. Again, you can see Brad Schoenfeld is an author on this. And in this, there were different volume match loads. So there was differences in the amount of work that were done either with higher or lower loads. Once again, you can see that the differences in strength are favoring the heavier loads in almost all conditions. But importantly, there was no difference in any of the hypertrophy outcomes. So long as you go to muscular failure or close to it, in other words, if everybody puts in a good effort when they're lifting the lighter weights, you can see the same sorts of changes in muscular hypertrophy. So perhaps the strength and endurance continuum needs some degree of revision. And I would perhaps suggest that it looks something like this. Hypertrophy can happen at all kinds of loads. Even at some of the lower loads, it may dissipate at some higher loads, maybe below 20% of 1 RM, for example, that becomes much more endurance-like in its outcome. Strength, however, is probably only minimized at these lower loads up here, or the higher repetition maximum continuum, because you don't get a chance to practice lifting heavier loads. If all you want to do is emphasize strength, then you should definitely have individuals lift heavier weights. There's no question about that. But for hypertrophy, I would put it to you that it can be achieved at a variety of different loads across the strength endurance continuum. Muscular endurance might be the same as strength. In other words, if we allowed individuals who lifted heavier loads to practice their endurance, they would probably get better at doing it too. So the last external variable I'm going to talk about are acute endogenous hormonal responses. And we've known for probably something like 5 or 6 decades that if you perform a bout of strenuous resistance exercise, you get a rise in acute endogenous hormonal responses. The hormones that go up are traditionally testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factor. All of these hormones are ostensibly anabolic in their outcome and their effects on skeletal muscle. And some people have even suggested that they're responsible for changes in muscle strength. So the first paradigm that I'm going to show you is that you can get local hypertrophy in one leg that trains without any rises in anabolic hormones. So in this paradigm, we had individuals train only one of their legs for 8 weeks. And you can see that when we compare the cross-sectional area changes in a trained leg versus an untrained leg, or the changes in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, they're confined almost entirely to the trained limb. In other words, you get increases in muscle fiber cross-sectional area and muscle cross-sectional area in only the trained limb. At the same time, when we look at the acute rises in anabolic hormones, this is testosterone, free testosterone, we've got sex hormone binding globulin here, you can see that there's no change in testosterone. And so the conclusion from this study, and I could show you growth hormone here, it doesn't really matter, is that there's no need for rises in acute anabolic hormone concentrations to see rises in muscle cross-sectional area or hypertrophy. So what about support for a mechanism? Is there a plausible mechanism that exists to explain changes in the process of muscle protein synthesis with a rise in anabolic hormones? So the second paradigm here I'm going to show you is one that we utilize in which we compared arms under a low hormone and a high hormone condition. The low hormone condition involves simply doing arm curls using only a single arm. On a separate day, individuals performed a very high intensity leg resistance exercise workout, which resulted in a large rise in anabolic hormones. So both testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1 were all elevated, albeit for about 30 minutes. And then this arm subsequently performed resistance exercise and would have been bathed in these ostensibly anabolic hormones and should, if the hormone hypothesis is correct, have gotten much bigger than this arm. First, we wanted to see whether there was any mechanistic basis to support this outcome. I'll just show you first, this is work done by Dan West, who was a PhD student of mine, in which you can see in the high hormone concentration, condition, we get rises in testosterone. We traditionally get rises in cortisol. That's always what we see. And you get nothing in the low hormone concentration condition. When we looked at the rates of muscle protein synthesis and we compared the rested rates in the compared to the high hormone versus the low hormone condition, you can see that in both arms, there was exactly the same rise in muscle protein synthesis. And again, you might ask yourself, well, that's just the acute response. What about resistance training? In other words, does this work in the real world? So the third paradigm then is to use this model that we've established of arm only, which is the low hormone condition, arm and leg. So in other words, a heavy leg resistance workout that then subsequently is followed by the contralateral arm resistance workout. And this arm, again, not just acutely, but training-wise, should get bigger than this arm. So to test this, I'm just going to show you that the paradigm worked. In other words, we're looking at, this is the area under the curve, so the net exposure, if you like, to testosterone in the arm only, in the white, versus the arm plus the leg. And you can see that there was a much greater rise in testosterone in the arm and leg condition, both pre-training, this is after the first exercise bout, and post-training, so right after the last exercise bout. When we look at the changes in elbow flexor cross-sectional area, so the arms themselves, when we assess these using MRI, again, the gold standard, you can see that in the arm plus leg versus the arm only condition, there were equivalent rises in, equivalent increases in elbow flexor cross-sectional area. So the extent of hypertrophy was not influenced by the hormonal status under which the arm performed the resistance exercise. So what have I told you so far? First of all, I think it's important to emphasize that diet or protein is greater protein intake is sufficient and necessary for gains in lean body mass. The effect, however, is small. In other words, you could manipulate protein in lots of different ways. You could talk about the type of protein, plant versus animal, and I don't think you'd find much of a difference because protein in none of the situations we have seen, affects muscle growth to an extent that would make me think that it's important. When we talk about load, I think it's important to talk about heavier weights being both sufficient but not necessary for inducing hypertrophy and gains in strength. Lighter weights develop hypertrophy to the same extent. We've seen that, and they also develop strength. Finally, from a hormonal standpoint, the acute post-exercise rise in anabolic hormones is neither sufficient nor necessary for the induction of hypertrophy and strength gains. So this has led us to an evidence-based view in which we view internal variables, in other words, variables that are responding to these external variables, as being a much greater influence over the outcome, the function here, which is hypertrophy. So the idea in showing the size of these boxes here is to show you the degree of importance we think of all these variables. So there are lots of biochemical outcomes that are probably dependent on genetics, transcriptomics, and epigenetic variables that are much greater in their influence at determining outcomes like things like resistance exercise variables, loads, sets, and reps, diet. We're including sleep in here, and we include supplements, although they're probably, with the exception of creatine, going to have a much smaller effect. So we've summarized that in a review that just got published. Chang-Yun Lim is the lead author. He's a postdoc in my lab. So I'm just going to skip a little bit forward here and ask, some people always ask us the question at this point, whether we can show non-unilateral model changes or real-world gains. So I want to show you some data in which we compared a whole body split routine for 12 weeks with these guys exercising 5 days a week. And I'm going to show you a lower versus a higher responder. So in other words, if we take somebody and we train them, are they this guy here or are they this guy here? In other words, the guy in blue here is indicated versus the guy in red, just to emphasize where they exist on this continuum. These are data taken from a training study that we performed a number of years ago. And what I'm going to highlight here are the person in red who gained, in terms of lean body mass with 12 weeks of training, almost 8 kilos. And then the individual who performed the exact same routine and gained almost nothing. Some of the things that you need to realize about this. First of all of the workouts were individually supervised. So it's not like this person did not work as hard as this person. They received the same external motivation. At the same time, we had diet records, and we actually had these individuals on protein supplements, whether they were in this group or this group. So there was actually no difference between these two individuals with respect to the amount of protein that they were taking in or the amount of energy that they were taking in. So how do these two individuals compare when it comes to the amount of muscle mass that they gained? So I'm going to plot them along with all of these other individuals here, and just realize that this individual gained 100 grams of lean body mass, whereas this individual gained 7.8 kilos. So that's a 78-fold, not a percent, but a 78-fold difference in the amount that's gained here. So here they are plotted on their with lean mass on the x-axis here against the area under the curve of their free testosterone responses. And this is the individual in blue, and this is the individual in red. And you can see that there's not a particularly strong relationship between changes in testosterone and changes in lean body mass, and nothing that would make me think that it's testosterone that affects the difference in muscle mass that these two individuals have gained. At the same time, if we look at the response of growth hormone, again plotting the area under the curve, again, not an impressive relationship between changes in growth hormone and changes in lean body mass here. And you can see this is our low responding individual who actually appears in the upper ranges of growth hormone response, and our high responding individual here who appears in actually right in the middle of the response range. And so the individual with the highest growth hormone response here is actually right in the middle of gains. So there's actually, in our opinion, no evidence to support the thesis that acute post-exercise rises in systemic testosterone, growth hormone, or IGF-1 are important in stimulating rises in muscle protein synthesis and gains in lean body mass or increments in strength. It's at this point when most people say, but steroids work. And I think that that's an important distinction. Steroids do work, but there's an enormous difference between the two scenarios, and to compare them is flawed logic. We're talking about small changes in systemic hormone concentrations that exist for between 15 to 30 minutes, or maybe even shorter, and their influence on the outcomes of resistance training, hypertrophy, and strength. When people take anabolic steroids, obviously the rise in testosterone or growth hormone is there for the duration of the time that they're taking the steroid, and it doesn't go up and down like it would in a normal situation. And we've tried to capture that in this figure. In other words, this is a normal individual who experiences up and down rises in testosterone that fluctuate throughout the day over the course of a week. In this individual here, what we've done is superimposed the small increase in endogenous testosterone that would occur after a bout of resistance exercise. And you can see it spiking right here. When we look at the area under the curve, so we integrate the net exposure to testosterone, you can see that it's not different between these two conditions. Somebody taking 200 milligrams of testosterone enanthate, you can see has a net testosterone exposure that is much greater. So this is the delivery of exogenous hormones here. And they do not have the same fluctuations in anabolic hormones that normal or unsupplemented individuals do. So it's a false paradigm to compare these scenarios to these two scenarios and say, well, testosterone has an effect here. Why doesn't it work here? The main point is this is exogenous delivery of a synthetic form of testosterone that hangs around for much, much longer. And the two scenarios are not actually comparable. So when do such hormones have an effect? And I think the important point again to emphasize here is at the extremes of these hormones when the effects are obvious. So we can talk about conditions of overt deficiency of both of these hormones, testosterone and growth hormone, or exaggerated or exogenous or even disease-specific situations. So the normal daily diurnal variation in these hormones compared to the extremes of a clinical condition or an enhanced condition like taking anabolic steroids is something like this. This is where the normal diurnal fluctuation exists, and these are where anabolic conditions clinical conditions exist. We could, for example, use the condition of hypogonadism or hypopituitarism. And in hypogonadism, there's no doubt that testosterone is now down in these sorts of ranges, well outside the normal anabolic range. And we can expect for somebody to lose muscle mass or become muscularly wasted. At the same time, we could expect for individuals who have hypopituitarism to be short of stature. They're born as dwarfs. They're small people, but it's their stature that's affected. People with hypopituitarism or classic, what we call lack of growth hormone, actually have muscle mass that is perfectly in line with their stature. At the same end, people who have hyperpituitarism or giantism, if you want to call it that, have a stature that makes them taller, but they have muscle mass that is completely in line with the stature. So growth hormone probably doesn't even have an anabolic effect on muscle per se, but steroid use definitely does. In other words, you can get exogenous administration of hormones, but these are 2 standard deviations greater than the normal anabolic fluctuation. So finally, we've tried to summarize these anabolic hormonal effects. And in this figure, and in which we've had no resistance exercise, so this is just the normal physiological changes. And in people who have their testosterone either ablated because of a clinical condition, for example, like men who are diagnosed with prostate cancer, do experience a change in muscle size. Similarly, men just taking anabolic hormones will experience an increase in muscle size. If we add resistance exercise to that, you can see that the whole curve shifts upwards. In other words, we can offset some of the changes in muscle size in people or in men who have androgen deprivation therapy or hypogonadism. And similarly, so we can do it in clinical scenarios that don't involve manipulations of hormones, because resistance exercise is anabolic unto itself. But these two numbers right here are from changes in the highest versus the lowest rise in anabolic hormones that exist during the exercise period itself, which are not comparable to exogenous supplementation. At the same time, if we take anabolic steroids, engage in a heavy resistance exercise training program, we can expect greater gains. I think the best evidence to show you that testosterone is not having an anabolic influence is to ask you, if testosterone is so important, why do women who lift weights hypertrophy? And I could show you a meta-analysis here from Greg Nuckols and Jim Krieger, and Brandon Roberts was actually the lead author, that shows that from a relative percentage standpoint, women gain about the same amount of muscle mass as men when they engage in resistance training. The difference is that women start at a lower and men at a higher level, but they go up and down to the same degree. So I think that that's probably the hardest line of evidence that I could offer you to say that testosterone is not a driver of muscle growth beyond the time during puberty, when boys experience a large surge in testosterone and women do not. After that, men and women track each other almost one for one with the amount of testosterone, with the amount of muscle mass gain that they experience during a period of resistance training. So I thank you very much for your attention. I'd be very happy to answer some questions. Hopefully there are a few in the chat.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture. Professor Phillips, I have a few questions. So first one, are there differences in protein intake in men and women? Do women need the same amount per kilogram of body weight, or is there a difference?
That's a great question. Women tend to consume, in our experience anyway, lower amounts of protein than men. We don't see any evidence, at least there are some of the studies that appear in the meta-analyses that do compare men versus women. We don't see any greater or different need in protein needs with men versus women. So if I had to guess, I would say that probably no, there wouldn't be a difference in the recommendations. In our hands, when we've done dose response studies to try and look at the amount of protein that people need, it probably goes up to about as high as 1.6. You might get tiny, small gains past that, but 1.6 tends to get about, I'd say about 90% of the response, to be honest with you. So men, women, if you could aim for about 1.6 grams of protein per kilo per day, that would be an optimal protein intake.
So the 2.2 grams per kilogram to up to 3 to 1 in dieting population, is it still useful or does it change?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a diet situation, you're definitely talking about trying to get protein into the system to offset losses that might occur if you're in a negative energy balance. So you could go as high as 2.2. We've got one study at least that shows that 2.4 was able to allow lean mass gains to happen during a period of energy restriction. I think too much beyond that, it's probably not necessary. But just to appreciate that the biggest driver of retention of mass in an energy deficit, and similarly to drive energy or a lean mass gain in an energy surplus, is definitely lifting. Like it's so rare to think of a situation where protein could be the rate limiting step. I mean, I'm all for optimal intakes, but beyond a certain extent, you can digest lots of protein, but your body has a hard time using it. So it's probably prudent to say that up to 2.2 or thereabouts if you're really cautious, but I don't think that it has a huge effect.
So people still has to work out. It is not enough to eat lots of proteins.
Exactly.
I say this to my clients every day.
Yeah. No, I mean, people want the shortcut, or they believe that it's something beyond the working out that's having the effect. And I always say to people that, you know, the working out changes how your muscle responds to nutrients. So, you know, the nutrients don't do much for you, you know, in the absence of working out. So yeah, you still need to get to the gym, do it regularly, work hard, recover, repeat, you know. So yeah, the diet is in there, but you know, you saw the squares that we use. We think it's a smaller influence than performing resistance exercise for sure.
Perfect, thank you. I would like to know your opinion on protein leverage hypothesis. Is it a real thing in humans or just in animals?
Yeah. So, you know, it's great work. I got a lot of respect for, you know, Jeff Simpson and David Rabenheimer and their work. I think when we look at it in humans, and there are some really great papers out there, below a certain level, people eat more to maybe try and get protein back. So that's the protein lever end of things. What I've seen less evidence to support is that beyond an intake of about probably, you know, 16, 17% of total energy, it forces energy intake down. So you can still consume a lot of protein, and I don't think it's an effective lever to reduce energy intake, with the possible exception that you might experience a reduction in some appetite hormones. So in animals, it works very well. Animals are driven by slightly different pressures, the biggest environmental pressure of which is A, to survive, and then B, to reproduce. Humans, lots of other reasons why, you know, survival is important, but eating, unless you're in a food scarce situation, doesn't really appear to go with the energy leverage up and down. Down, yes, maybe not in the upside. So if you're on a low protein intake, protein leverage would suggest that you eat more to compensate for that. And that, I think that there's good evidence for in humans. I don't know that there's good evidence to suggest that high protein intakes you eat less.
Perfect, thank you. Well, people eat because of boredom, emotions, etc. Right?
Yeah, lots of people in front of a television screen, they don't even know why they're eating.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, does higher protein intake lead to faster aging? Does it depend in particular amino acids like methionine, etc.?
Yeah. Again, you know, the science of protein and its aging acceleration effects comes like 100% from caged animal studies. And so I don't dispute the findings and the science there. The question is how well, or do they even translate over to a human condition? And I think that there are two sort of things that I point out. First of all, animals are held in a closed environment, and they're in the same environment every single day of their lives. And I don't think that in any way faithfully recapitulates what happens in people. I mean, we're exposed to a lot more environmental stressors. We're exposed to diseases and all kinds of things that just simply wouldn't be part of what these animals do. The other point is rarely are those animals allowed to have access to exercise, so a wheel, or let alone maybe, you know, lifting weights, for example. The other point is that the specific amino acid restriction and like methionine restriction and everything is really just another way of saying protein restriction, because as long as if you peel back methionine, it's always the start codon amino acid for every protein. So it's not surprising that its restriction is effective. But the only way to do that in humans, because you can't just take away methionine, you'd have to take away protein. So it's never going to be a testable hypothesis in humans. And there's no rodent data. Oh, there's not rodent. There's no primate data. So we have nothing in primates with protein restriction or methionine or specific amino acid restriction to show that it extends lifespan or results in less disease. So I'm less convinced that those data will ever translate over to humans. I do think that the human condition and the performance of exercise effectively create so much noise in the human condition that I don't think you'd ever expect to see any protein or age lengthening effects of protein restriction in human beings. So
there is another part of that question. I will say it.
Okay.
It is from Miloslav. What is optimal for longevity regarding protein intake? My theory is that theoretically it would be the best to restrict proteins in adulthood and then increase protein intake in older age because of sarcopenia and anabolic resistance. But
yeah, well, that's the Walter Longo hypothesis. In other words, he shows an increased rate of cancer and diabetes and all kinds of things and mortality early in life. And then in later life, you need more because you're frail if you don't eat more protein. We have some data that actually challenges that notion. We don't think that their analysis of that data was particularly good. We think that there's better ways of looking at the data that they looked at. We just need to get that data published. It's
perfect.
been reviewed several times, and the reviewers push back on certain things, and I think because it upsets a lot of people. But so hopefully soon. Stay tuned.
I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah.
So we should consume lots of proteins still, at any age.
I still think that the minimum intake should be about 1.2 grams of protein per kilo per day for older people in particular. And I think that there's benefits up to about 1.6. After 1.6, I'm not as convinced that you're getting much of a benefit if you're getting anything at all, to be honest with you. But, you know, that's a matter of debate. I know a lot of other people would have a different opinion or dismiss what I would have to say, but that's at least what I see based on, you know, populations who were trying to maximize their health. In older people, you can't get more and more protein into their muscles. It just does. There's a condition called anabolic resistance, and it just doesn't go into muscles. So you can eat as much as you want. It won't actually do you any good.
But when my client is dieting, I can give him more than 1.6. You know, the satiation and also muscle prevention. Okay, just to be sure.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Can we ask last one?
Yeah, please, question? Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, last year we've discussed, then it was kind of new study that could change paradigm in protein intake, you know, animal protein versus plant protein, and the leucine intake, BCAA, etc. Is there a change in our paradigm or not? Could you talk more about this, please?
Yeah, I think here's the fundamental basis. Animal proteins have higher quality protein than plant proteins. That's the truth. The question is, does it make a difference? In other words, if I were to train, you know, two twins, one had a plant-based diet and one had an animal-based diet, you know, does this twin gain less than this twin? And the answer is, as long as you hit 1.6, is absolutely not. Like, both are getting sufficient protein, both are getting sufficient leucine. The caveat is maybe that the plant protein eating individual or twin would have to consume mixed sources of plant proteins. So you can't just stick with one. So you have to be a little bit judicious about how you plan your protein intake if you're the plant eater. But I think the world is definitely changing, and we're seeing much more greater choice in plant proteins. And so I don't think it's as big an issue as people have made it out to be in the past, for sure.
Okay, so well, okay. Dr. Phillips, is there anything else you would like to say for this topic? Anything?
No, I mean, I hope that, you know, some of the stuff that I've said is, you know, some of it may be new, some of it may be old, but it challenges certain paradigms that we have. Like, I think for a while we thought, you know, protein was all important. And I was one of those people as well. But as time has gone on, my opinion is that it is important, but the effect is small. So a lot of the questions around protein and how much and everything are probably pretty small in terms of the impact that they have. Still, you know, the biggest driver, You have to go to the gym. You have to have a plan when you go there, and you need to work hard while you're there and then recover on the other side. But accept the fact that, most individuals will probably never get into the, sort of massive ranges of some people that they see in the gym, because that's a genetically determined outcome. But the effects of exercise and going to the gym from a health standpoint are enormous. And that doesn't matter what genes you have. So I think that's a good place to end.
I would just like to add, I've just reminded myself what I wanted to say about the plant proteins. It is much harder to have low calories and enough protein than if you use animal sources also.
It's true. It's true. You have to eat a lot more energy on the plant side to hit the protein intakes that you might want to hit. So you just have to be pretty physically active, which I think it always helps. And you have to be pretty judicious about how you plan your protein intake, for sure.
Exactly. Okay. So thank you very much for your time, Professor Phillips. I know you are a very busy person, and I really value this lesson. I think people will be very happy about this. We are honored to be able to learn from such a world-class scientist. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Martin. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so farewell, and thanks to Stuart and Institute of Modern Nutrition, as well as the audience. Next live stream will be with Dr. Karol Nadolski about endocrinology, hormones. And also you can be looking forward to Dr. Gabriel Fundaro, Vitamin PhD on Instagram, about gut microbiome. Thank you all, and Stuart, have a fine day.
You too. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.